Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the latest episode of the Writers Podcast. I have with me today guest writer Matthew Hughes. Hello, Matthew. How you doing?
I'm fine, thank you.
Very good. And Matthew, you are a writer of what type of fiction?
Pretty broad in general. I write fantasy of a certain kind, mostly dying Earth fantasy, and also space opera, far future stuff, and crime fiction, quite a lot of that in my early years, and one historical novel.
Right. So you've been in the writing business for quite a while.
Well, I've been a professional writer all my life. I
Right.
think I got my first paycheck in 1971.
Okay. Wow. Very good. And as you mentioned, you've written novels, and you're over 20 novels, and you've also written quite a few short stories that have appeared in such publications as the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, Asimov's, Alfred Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine, Lightspeed, Postscript, and so on. And you've also been in anthologies with George R. R. Martin and Gardner Dozois. So fantastic. And we're here to talk about your latest book, which I've mispronounced several times, so I'm going to let you say the title.
The title of the book and the name of the central character is Margolyam.
Margolyam. And you told a very interesting story about where you got that name from.
Well, I was a few stories back, actually, in another series. I needed a character to come and rescue my hero, and she popped into my head, and I realized that she looked just like one of my favorite English actresses, Miriam Margolyam, who's immensely funny, a little short, stubby woman with gray hair going all over the place. She's 80 years old now. And I thought, what the hell? I'll make her Margolyam.
Okay, so if she's out there and listening, there you go. You've got a character named after you in a series. So this book is the latest one in your Dying Earth fantasy series. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And how many books are in that series so far?
Oh, God, I'm not sure. 5, 6.
Okay. And
I'd have to look. My memory is not as good as it used to be.
Right. How many books do you plan to write for this series?
I'm actually thinking of starting another one. What I've done, I got into it when George Martin and Gardner Dozois asked me for a story for their anthology Rogues, the only bestseller I've ever been in. And I came up with this character, and the setting was an adaptation of Jack Vance's wonderful Dying Earth, far future magic fantasy universe. And then I thought, well, that's a good character. I'd done him at the end of his career, so I went back and had episodes and sold, I think, 8 of them to the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. And then in the middle of that series of stories, another character came in as a kind of antagonist, a pain in the butt. And he was the sort of, my original character is Raphalon. He's a thief. Not a very lucky one, but competent. And then in came a character called Cascor, who was, you might say, a private detective of a kind. And I got interested in him. So when I'd finished the Raphalon series, I wrote a series about Cascor. And Margolyam appeared towards the end of that series. And then I thought, I'll do one about her. So I'm kind of doing a hopping from ice flow to ice flow, character to character. And the one that I'm planning to start after Labor Day is 2 characters who are sort of like supporting roles in another collection of a guy who was a wizard's henchman.
Wow. Okay, so you've got a lot of books. How do you keep it all straight? Or you take copious notes? You don't.
No, although I did a couple of years ago, I did a kind of who's who of my space opera and Dying Earth, the main characters, and I put it on my webpage. But unfortunately, my webpage disappeared because of some sort of server upgrade, and it's going to cost me a couple of grand to revive it.
Oh, geez.
But I used the Wayback Machine and found that piece that I'd written and I'm putting it with additions because I've written several books since then. I'm going to put it up on Medium when I do my newsletter in the next little while.
Very cool. So you've been writing since you said you got your first paycheck back in the 70s. So growing up, did you always want to be a writer?
I'm not sure I always wanted to be. When I first went to university, I was thinking of becoming a linguist. I already had English, French, and Spanish down, and I was taking German. And then that didn't really grab me anymore. So I thought about being a teacher, because then I could write, in my summers. And that didn't work out. It turned out it was a wonderful thing that in my university's program, the second day of your course, they put you in a school to teach grade 5 kids. Nice middle class school. I hated it. God, I couldn't imagine spending the rest of my life doing that.
Right.
So next option was become a journalist. And so I became a reporter. Which those days you could do if you could write, and if you could get into a newsroom and show somebody clippings that you could write. And I had stuff from the university newspaper. Bang, there I am. Suddenly I'm covering suburban council meetings and then writing features and then summer staff on a daily. And I was actually heading on. I edited 2 small newspapers, like, weeklies. And I was just finishing my 6-month try-in period on the second one when a guy came into the office and said, "How would you like to go to Ottawa and be an assistant to the guy who just got elected as an MP for this area?" And it took me about a week to make up my mind. I finally tossed a coin, came down heads, and off I went. So when I got there, I was doing the kind of stuff you do when you work for a politician, helping people with passport and immigration problems and pensions and so on. But then he came into the office and said, they want me to second the debate on the speech from the throne, which is where the government sets out its policies.
Right.
So write me a speech. And I'd never written a speech before, but I found out what was expected and wrote one, and he loved it. First draft. And he went and gave it in the House of Commons, and it was a big hit. One of the key movers of the party came, put his arm around his shoulders and said, "You're going places," that kind of thing. And then he started to get all these requests to go and speak, because everybody's saying, "Hey, this guy gives great speeches." And then I got recruited by ministers' offices to be staff speechwriter for the Minister of Justice and the Minister of Environment eventually.
Wow.
Then I freelanced for 30 years in Vancouver.
And when did you start writing fiction?
Oh, I wrote one. My first novel I wrote bad. Well, I wrote a bad one when I was unemployed for a while between newspaper jobs, but I won't talk about that. I should dig it out sometime, see if I could fix it. My first one I wrote in 1987. I actually spent about 4 years doing it now and then when I didn't have something else to do to feed the family. It landed me a really big New York agent, a guy long gone now. His name was Oscar Collier, and I believe he was the first one to ever make $1 million book deal. And he loved the book, but he couldn't sell it. It kept coming back with editor's notes saying, "Well, it's not a typical fantasy novel, is it?" And that was it. Finally, I sold it to a small Canadian press, which brought it out the week they were being taken over and dissolved. So it went back to the warehouse. But time went on, and when I had time away from speech writing, I would do more. And I started doing crime fiction and started writing short stories for the magazines. And I had one novel published by Doubleday Canada. And I was going somewhere. But then I read a magazine interview with Betsy Mitchell from Warner Aspect, the science fiction imprint of Time Warner Books. And she said she was looking for not typical fantasy novels. And I happen to have one, still.
Right.
So I sent it to her, and she bought it, and she commissioned a sequel, and I wrote that, and it came out. They were funny, ironical, satirical books, and unfortunately, they came out just before 9/11 in 2001. So the mood changed, and they did not do very well. But they did well enough that a senior editor at Tor said, "Well, why don't you do one for me?" Because I had become kind of Book List called me the heir apparent to Jack Vance, who's one of the greatest science fiction fantasy writers ever. And the guy who at Tor was a big Vance fan. And he said, "Well, do me a Vance." So I did. Again, Vance was a niche author, and I'm a niche author. There are a certain subset of the readership that just loves my stuff and loved his stuff, and the rest of them go, this is weird, So, yeah.
Right.
Certainly, I found myself though getting offers from publishers to write Jack Vance type science fiction and fantasy, and my plan of being a crime writer just sort of went sideways.
Right.
Yeah. But I do work criminals and crime into my science fiction and fantasy stories.
Right. So
like Raphael the Thief.
Okay. So were you a voracious reader growing up?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I lived in the library. Had a very dysfunctional family and no money. We were working poor.
Okay.
And the place I could go to was the library and sit there and read a book.
Right.
Bring one or two home and hide in the corner and read them there.
Okay.
So, yeah, I read classics. I read Hemingway. I read Steinbeck. I read Robert Graves, I, Claudius, and his others. Nicholas Kazantzakis, a wonderful Cretan writer who wrote Over the Greek, was my favorite for quite a while. Everybody. And a lot of science fiction and historical novels.
Okay. Do you, beyond the names you mentioned, did you have favorite writers that you love to read?
Well, in historicals, there was a guy called Lionel Sprague de Camp, lovely name.
Right.
And he wrote interesting, funny adventure type historicals set in ancient Persia or the time of Alexander the Great. The guy who built Colossus of Rome was one of his heroes. He was one of my favorites. Yeah. Okay. And then as I got older, it was more into people like Joseph, Catch-22, and Terry Southern, the people who were writing sort of what they used to call black comedy, satirical stuff. I love that.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's turn to your writing process. I'm interested to find out what kind of a writer you are, since you started out in nonfiction, as speech writing and journalism and that. Did you
there's a lot of fiction in speech writing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very true. Okay, I'll give you that one. But did you find the transition from like journalism to fiction writing easy or difficult?
It's two separate factories, or a factory that has to shut down and retool. When I was doing journalism, when I was doing speech writing, I couldn't come home in the evening and try and write a short story. It just didn't come. And I'm an entirely intuitive writer. I rely on my unconscious, the guy in the back of my head. He feeds me stuff. I type it out. Yeah. And I have no idea when I start a story where it's going to go.
Okay.
I just, I have a character, a situation which is normal to that character, and then something happens that creates a problem, and the character responds, and then other characters get involved with their, agendas, and somehow it all works out. I mean, my first drafts are about 90% of the final.
Okay. Wow.
It's like the story already exists in my head and it gets fed to me like 1,000 words at a time.
Cool.
Yeah.
So you're very, very organic.
Yeah, I have one, a ghost story, which is also a crime story. It's called Ghost Dreams. It was published by PS Publishing in the UK. I've got the North American ebook rights, so you can get it on Amazon.
Okay.
And that started out, I was going to write a real farce. There was a writer from the 30s and 40s called Thorne Smith, who wrote wonderful stories about ghosts, like the Topper series, where these drunken ghosts are sort of harassing this staid banker who was their neighbor before they died. I was going to write one of them, something funny. So I got a burglar and a ghost. That's what I started with. And yet, as the characters developed, it became a serious story. And it was actually became a story about two people, the ghost and the burglar, who had been wounded by life, and who somehow found a relationship with each other that healed them both. And it's quite a nice little book. Not my usual stuff, and I don't think my readers are too warm to it, but I like it.
Okay. That's very interesting. So let's turn to your latest book then, and this is from the Dying Earth series. Do you want to give a little, do you have your elevator pitch, or what exactly the Dying Earth series is about?
I should, because not everybody knows Jack Vance.
Right.
Dying Earth is a subgenre of fantasy, and it deals with the very, very, very far future, and it covers people like Lovecraft, and especially Vance, who had a book out in about the time I was being born, called The Dying Earth, which was a collection of episodes that made a kind of novel. And he wrote several more books in that. So you have a world in which everything has been done and redone and forgotten and revived and done and then done again. There is nothing new. Everything is old. And it's a world of people who are, I won't say actually psychopathic, but certainly pursuing their own interests and the hell with everybody else. There's a great deal of picaresque individualism in it. So I describe it as a world of wizards and walled cities, sort of like Renaissance Italy, but with magic.
Okay.
And I've set stories in it because it appeals to me, and I like the kind of characters that exist in that. The thing about Vance, people focus on his quite unique voice and prose and so on, but the thing that appeals to me about Jack Vance's work, and that I try to emulate in my own, is that sense of mood. That this is you sort of slip into that world of his and of mine, I suppose, and it has a certain feel to it. And if you're a jaded, cynical person like poor old me, it fits quite well. Yeah.
Very good.
Well, I've had an unusual life.
Right, right. Yeah, indeed. And so how many books are in this series so far?
Oh, God. Let's see. Raphalon, Cascor, I've mentioned, Baldemar, Margolyam. There's more. Oh, yeah, the Ghost Wrangler, about a necromancer. I think there's, and a god in hiding and a god in chains. We're looking at, I think, 7. Margolyam will be the 8th, I think.
Right. And so if I understand the Dying Earth concept that you just described, these books don't link to each other. They just take place in the same world? Is that
pretty much? I'm exploring an environment.
Right.
Although, as I say, I'll take a side character from a previous book and develop a story around that person. I've done that a few times.
Right. So what's the story with Margolyam?
Well, Margolyam appeared in the Cascor series of stories as an elderly sorceress living in a terrible place called Olifract, which is a city that a lot of wizards moved into it, people who didn't get along with other wizards and don't get along with each other once they're there. And they built some mountains around it and sealed it off. And she ended up there as a young woman and stayed for a very long time. So she was elderly when I introduced her, because I was thinking of Miriam Margolyam,
Right.
wonderful woman. But then I thought I'll also do an origin story and then a coming of age story, what she was like as a young woman,
Okay.
because in the world that I am posited, to be an actual thaumaturge, a wizard, you have to go to the Institute of Hermetic Studies and spend 7 years getting an apprenticeship and graduating. Then you can work your way up through degrees. But they don't like girls coming in too much. You know, it's that kind of patriarchal kind of world.
Okay.
So she gets into trouble, which is not her fault, but she gets the blame, and they throw her out. But she's an orphan who came to live with her aunt in a small town, a market town, and her aunt is the local healer and sorceress, also not an institute graduate. But as time goes by, it turns out that Margolyam is one of these very rare people. And here comes the explanation. In my world, people have books of magic, and some of them are centuries, even millennia old, and have been handled by many different wizards over the years, and they have absorbed a certain amount of power from being used. So they're not easy to work with. The analogy I've said, it's sort of like a spirited steed. You really have to be a good rider to work with it. But then there are some people, and most wizards don't believe these people exist, but there are some people whose peculiar resonances, the way they're put together, make them what are called tome ticklers, which is the magic book equivalent of a horse whisperer. The most obstreperous, nasty book will just open up for them, which amazes people and outrages some. And because she has that talent, things happen with her and to her that change the course of her life. I'll put it that way. So there's struggles and conflicts and intrigue and all that kind of stuff that I like to put in books.
Okay. Yeah. Is it fair to say that sort of sounds like Harry Potter for adults? Is that a fair?
Not quite. No.
Okay.
I mean the period at the Institute for her is quite short. It's only one chapter.
Okay.
And then she's off to Olifrac to see what happens.
All right. And is there a main protagonist in the story or antagonist? I'm sorry.
Oh, no, there's a few. There's a wizard called Fatej, calls himself Fatesh the Force, who is interested in using her. And then there's another wizard who actually dates from thousands of years before, who was imprisoned in one of his own books of magic by a group of people who disapproved of him. And she finds the book and she finds him, and she actually gets him out into a spare body, shall we say. And then he starts out as kind of vague and faint. He's been, locked in a book for thousands of years. But gradually he regains his old personality. And he's an absolutely horrible person. And not the kind you want to have power over you. So she has to deal with that.
Are you someone who is a writer that likes to create magic systems? Is that?
I'm extrapolating Vance's. Vance had a wonderful system. It's actually the basis for Dungeons and Dragons. Magic. Yeah.
Okay.
It's quite wonderful. There are spells, and you have to get them into your head and hold them there, but you can only hold 3 or 4. And once you use them, they're not there anymore. So you can't just use them over and over again. You have to go back to the book, and some simple ones you can remember, but they're not very powerful.
Okay. All right. And this book is out now, correct?
Yeah, I self-published it on Amazon and Kobo and other places as an ebook and a print-on-demand paperback.
Okay, very good. And is this the last book that you're doing in this series, or
I said I've got another one I'm going to start
right?
probably next week.
Okay,
And again, it's two characters who were minor characters in earlier stories will now look at them around.
all right. Do you write uh, in any other books, or at the same time, or are you specifically just
No,
on?
I do one at a time, but
Right.
I've done all kinds of stuff. I've ghost written two memoirs for prominent Canadians that I've used to write speeches for.
Okay.
I've actually written a book on how to write speeches, but I've never done anything with it except put it on the hard drive.
Okay.
And I write short stories and novellas.
Right.
In fact, I want to plug one.
Sure.
I was in the 70s a great fan of the Rockford Files.
Okay. Right.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. Because I worked at home at 4 o'clock every afternoon. I could sit down and watch a rerun episode. It
Right.
was absolutely my favorite thing of the day.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and I'd written a novella. It's about 27,000 words, I think. It's about a young guy who comes to San Francisco, not LA, but he wants to be a Jim Rockford. He's an
Mm.
absolute, obsessed with it. And of
Right.
course, he meets a girl, and then the girl has a brother who's involved with some neo Nazis. And it's all about uh, an old detective by the name of Abner, A.H. Abner,
Mm-hmm.
who is obsessed with the gangster who wrecked his leg and so on in an incident on the docks like 25, 30 years before. And the gangster's name was Modi Bick. And he drove a big old white Cadillac.
Mm.
And now, just as my hero arrives in San Francisco, Modi comes back in the
Mm.
Cadillac after
Mm.
having been at the bottom of the bay for 25 whatever years. And of course, it's a burlesquing of Moby Dick.
Right.
And it's fun. It's funny.
Right.
I've done a lot of comedy writing in my time, and this was a funny tribute to the Rockford Files. And
Okay.
it's called Modi, Modie. I put it on Amazon for 99 cents, not to make any money, but so that people like me can find it and enjoy it.
Right.
So if
Oh.
anybody out there is a Rockford Files fanatic or
Mm-hmm.
even devotee, go and look on Amazon for Modi, Modie.
Right.
Worth a buck.
Right. So you've been in the business for quite a while. I'm curious, what's your views on the writing business today as opposed to when you started out?
Well, I think the corporatization of publishing has been a disaster
Hmm.
for fiction.
Right.
Um, you have this phenomenon now of it's all bestsellers and nothing else. And when a
Right.
best-selling author dies, they hire some hack to keep doing characters.
Mm.
Like one of my favorites is Robert B. Parker,
Right.
and he's been dead for a few years, but they're still bringing out Spencer stories,
Right.
and he's not as good. The
Right.
man had a genius touch,
Yeah.
and I'm told he even asked before he died that they not do that, but his family decided, hey, it's money, let's do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sad but
So
true.
yeah, corporatization has everything now is series. That's
Yeah.
because the marketing people can better project how many sales they're going to get if they're
Right.
continuing the same character. And you get people like Ian Rankin doing his Reba stories. He wanted to quit and do
Mm-hmm.
a different set of people, characters, but they kind of, I think, leaned on him, and he kept on doing Rebus long after Rebus had retired from the force and was hobbling around on bad knees. There
Mm-hmm.
he is. Drag him out, push him through the streets again.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's I think you're totally right about that. It's unfortunate, like the mid-list market has pretty well disappeared for a lot of writers. They're
Oh yeah,
basically all gone to, self-publishing.
yeah. Well, I'm one of them.
Yeah.
I haven't sent a book to a publisher since I think 2019, 2020.
Right.
It's just the money is better, and it comes by every, you get it after 2 months.
Right.
Amazon sends you the money right into your bank account.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Matt, I've really enjoyed talking to you. Is there anything else that you'd like to mention that hasn't come up yet in our chat?
I have a monthly newsletter
Mm-hmm.
that I put out by email.
Okay.
And if anybody sends me an email, I'll put them on the list. And they
Awesome.
also, new signups get a free ebook of one of my books.
Okay. And what's the email address that they should be sending it to?
For this one, it's Matthew Hughes, just one word,
Okay.
at arcanate.com. And I'll spell that for you, ARCHONATE.
Okay. Very good. I you've got quite the bibliography there, and you've received a lot of great praise. Like, I mean, I've seen people here like George R. R. Martin, David Gerald, Robert J. Sawyer. These are all big names in the world of science fiction and fantasy. So
yeah, George Martin has called me criminally underrated.
Right. Yeah.
On his blog. Yeah.
Yeah. That's
right. I am.
Yeah, that's too bad. Unfortunately, like as you said, it's the corporatization has really slammed the door for a lot of people. Unfortunately,
it's either bestsellers or debut novelists. And having been a debut novelist for a corporate publisher, I recognize that you get one shot, and if you don't make it, goodbye.
Yeah,
because I used to say you get all the nurturing that mama sea turtles give to their babies, which is hatch out, you're on your own. Yeah.
Right. Right. Okay, Matt. Well, I want to thank you very much for coming on, and people can look forward to your book. It's already out on Amazon, Kobo,
and along with about 30 others. So
30 others. So people, please check out Matt's book list on Amazon and see if something there tickles your fancy.
Yep.
All righty. Well, thank you very much, Matthew. You enjoy the rest of your day.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, you too. Take care now. Bye-bye.